Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Before we begin, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to support me. It helps a lot. You can also join my Patreon, give a couple bucks a month to keep the episodes coming, and we have a big fundraising goal there. I will talk about that at the end of the video. Many of us true crime and dark story lovers also like horror films. I am a horror film fanatic. Horror and documentary are mainly what I watch. I think from time to time we will cover some obscure cases here that are in different ways tied to horror films. I was thinking the other day about just how many of them there are, and I thought we should do a little series on this. Today I have for you the first two stories of that series. First, we will talk about Gary George, who claims he was inspired to do the things he did by the 2009 Australian horror film, The Loved Ones. It's a fantastic film. I've seen it several times. I love it when a horror film gives me something different because so many of them are the same. This one is not like anything else you've ever seen. Then we will talk about one of the most bizarre film-related crimes I've ever heard of that involves a man obsessed with Akasha from Queen of the Damned and what Akasha told him to do. All true crime fans know that the truth is stranger than fiction. Well, today, the truth is inspired by fiction. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Before we can talk about the first true crime story today, we must discuss the film that inspired the crime. I also need to tell you that there is not a lot of information on this crime. You know I like bringing you these more obscure cases, but man, sometimes it is hard to find a lot of detail on them. Now, I am not a believer in blaming art for people's bad deeds. When someone uses a knife to kill another person, we don't say, oh, he stabbed that man just like that stabbing in the Bible in 2 Samuel chapter 2. We don't blame the violent passages in the Bible for modern day violence, but people are quick to jump on things like video games and music and visual art and films and blame them for bad deeds committed by people, especially young people. It's not about the film or the art or the music. People are responsible for their own actions. And if they didn't get an idea from this film over here, they're going to get an idea from that film over there. If they're going to do something bad, they're going to do it. Yes, they might get ideas as to how they're going to commit a bad act, from maybe a film or a song, but I truly do not believe that art makes people violent. Violent people are violent people, and blaming anything but their decision to be violent is simply an excuse. So the film. The Loved Ones is an Australian horror film released in 2009, written and directed by Sean Byrne. The film stars Robin McLeavy. You might remember her from AMC's Hell on Wheels if you watched that. And it stars Xavier Samuel as the dark-hearted, handsome high school kid. I won't give away everything that happens in this film, and I won't give away the ending, but the plot is this. Brent gets into a terrible car accident with his father. He swerves on a rural road to miss a boy who is standing bloody and beaten in the middle of that road. Brent's father dies in that car accident, and Brent blames himself for his father's death. His life starts to take a serious downward spiral, but the one shining light in Brent's life is his girlfriend Holly. One day, a student named Lola asks Brent to the prom. Lola is secretly obsessed with Brent, and she knows he has a girlfriend, but she doesn't care. Brent very politely tells Lola that he is going to the prom with Holly, and that is not what Lola wants to hear. What she does next, this film is really well done, in my opinion. It is so twisted, because not only is Lola a psychopath, she is an enabled psychopath assisted by her very own father. The film is written really well, and it's a different kind of horror story. We see so much of the same stuff. Well, Brent goes on a walk the day of the prom to his secret spot where he kind of goes to think, and then he disappears. Lola has taken him because, you see, she is having a little private prom of her own at her house that night for just she and Brent. Well, her parents are there too. The torture scenes in this film are very well done, and what you find out towards the end of the film is truly shocking. This film is very gory and it's very bloody. There isn't much I see anymore that makes me wince, but there is a scene in this film, every time I see it, I'm just like, damn. You can really feel for Brent. The film has a fantastic and very satisfying ending, and it leaves you feeling complete. But while most of us watch a film like this and maybe talk about it with our friends, or if you're like me, you go online and read reviews and what other people think about the film, one person saw this film as a personal message and used it as a roadmap to commit unthinkable acts, acts that would leave a friend of his dead. This man is Gary George. I dug around for hours trying to find any sort of information on his childhood, his school years, his personal life, and I found absolutely nothing except for the fact that Gary was openly gay. That's about the only personal fact I could find on him. Now, the fact that I can't find much information might be because I'm in the States and this crime took place in the UK. Anytime you're on a search engine digging around for information online, your search engine results are based on the area that you live in. And even when you type in things like Gary George UK, it only pulls up the international articles on the story. I do use a VPN, but I still find it's really hard to find the little small town local paper news. But I did my best for you. What we do know about Gary George is that he was an alcoholic. He lived in Chester and he struggled. We know that he had a long history of not being able to keep a job. He was 41 years old in 2009, and Gary was not doing well at all. He'd had a few short-term apartments, but usually ended up getting evicted. And in 2009, Gary found himself homeless. Now, Gary was a huge horror movie fan. There are films that he claims to have seen 500 times or more. Now, I love my horror films, but I don't think I've seen any film more than 100 times. Maybe The Burbs, because The Burbs is one of my comfort movies that I turn on to fall asleep to, so maybe that one. But other than that, Gary has me beat by a long shot. Gary was also very big into witchcraft, and he told people that he was a witch. Now, I always chuckle at people like this because I know people who are into witchcraft, and they are completely and totally against violence of any kind. In fact, I would say that the people I know who consider themselves pagan or witches into witchcraft at some level are some of the most chill people I've ever met, and they're definitely strongly against all forms of violence. But you know, there are always people like Gary looking for something to attach themselves to in order to seem more interesting or in order to have something to blame for the bad acts that they're going to do. Gary had a friend in this man, 53-year-old Andrew Nall. Gary also had a friend named Christine Holleran, and she was 50 years old at the time of these events. Christine would often live with Gary when he had a place to live, and she, Gary, and Andrew were known to spend quite a bit of time together. What we know about this crime is that on the day of the murder, which was August 31st, Christine and Andrew had been together. They had taken a taxi together at one point during the day. Police later tracked that taxi movement and found that Andrew had withdrawn 100 pounds from his bank account while he and Christine were together. Now, again, this is in 2013, so there were cameras pretty much everywhere at that time in the UK. Christine and Andrew got into this taxi at about 1:45 in the afternoon. And when police interviewed the taxi driver that drove the pair, the taxi driver reported that the mood between the two was tense. The driver said that Christine was angry at Andrew and was speaking to him in a very abusive manner. She kept saying that he had done something to her that she would never forgive him for. After the two got out of the taxi, there's a gap of time where we're not sure what happened. But we do know that at about 6 o'clock that same evening, Andrew and Gary met up and went to Tesco Express on Delamere Street, where they bought some wine. A few minutes after that, they're seen on CCTV buying cider and sherry from McCall's on Brook Lane. Gary and Andrew then walked to Andrew's apartment, and shortly after they got there, Christine showed up. Now, why Christine would be spending time with Andrew when she was so angry with him, that's anyone's guess, but she was there. The trio spent quite a bit of time at Andrew's apartment. They were drinking. Apparently, Gary was always drinking, but on that day, Christine and Andrew had had quite a few drinks as well. What happened in that apartment? I will go into as much detail as I can here on this platform, but let's finish the timeline first. At 9:30 that same night, Gary and Christine showed up at Bargain Booze on Mill Lane to buy more alcohol. Andrew was not with them at that time. They bought some sherry, and while they were talking with the clerk at Bargain Booze, Gary kind of blurts out that his companion, Christine, who he points to, had been recently raped. Now, the clerk behind the counter was uncomfortable with the conversation, but I'm sure as a clerk at a place called Bargain Booze, you hear a lot of uncomfortable conversations. The clerk does remember Gary saying to Christine, "We will get him back. Don't you worry, we'll get him back." Well, they definitely did get Andrew. Not sure if Andrew was guilty of doing anything to Christine, but in Gary and Christine's minds, Andrew was the bad guy, and this is where the film comes into play. There will be a few spoilers here in the next minute or so if you want to watch The Loved Ones, you should probably stop here. I won't give away the ending or anything like that, but we are going to talk a little bit about the film. In the film, The Loved Ones, Lola kidnaps Brent and takes her to her house, which is very isolated out in the Australian outback. Brent wakes up dressed in a tuxedo and tied to a chair. He is seated at the dinner table in Lola's house. Lola is across from him, and then her parents are on either end of the table. Now, at first, Lola seems like she just wants to take some photos with Brent, but then things get very, very violent. I can't tell you a lot of the things that are done to poor Brent, but one of the most memorable scenes involves Lola carving a heart into Brent's chest and putting their initials on it as well. Gary George, who remember had seen this film like 500 times, tied Andrew to a chair and began carving his chest. But that is only after Andrew had been severely beaten. I have to be somewhat careful with my words here, but Andrew had been beaten and he had been stabbed repeatedly before he was tied up. In the film, after Lola carves this heart into Brent's chest, this is the scene that makes me wince. She takes handfuls of salt and throws it onto Brent and then rubs it into the fresh wound. And the scream that he screams, the actor does a really good job. Really good job. The horror is horrific. The screams are blood-curdling. It's a really, really gory scene. Great horror movie stuff. And apparently it inspired Gary as well. After Gary carved a long symbol all the way vertically down Andrew's chest, he took salt and threw it onto the wound and rubbed it in, and the pain must have been unimaginable. Gary and Christine were both pretty drunk. It was later discovered that not only had they been drinking wine and sherry, but they had also been doing cocaine and heroin. Both Christine and Gary were homeless at this time, so I'm not sure where the money was coming from for the drugs, but they got them somehow. And I don't usually say this, but I am glad for Andrew that he had been drinking and that he was also on those drugs, because I'm sure it helped to numb the pain a little bit. In the film, Lola, this is really disturbing. There's a scene involving Brent's eyes and a needle syringe. Well, Gary copied that somewhat because he took some type of a cleaning product and lifted Andrew's face and then poured this cleaning product directly into Andrew's eyes. When Gary was finished, Andrew had been stabbed 49 times, and those stab wounds were obviously the cause of death. After Andrew was dead, sitting with his pants down in his bedroom in a pool of his own blood, Gary and Christine left the flat and walked to a nearby convenience store. Gary told the shop clerk, "I've just killed my best mate." Apparently, the shop clerk did not call the police because Gary was left to wander. The following day, he was still drunk. He ran into a man on the sidewalk and broke a bottle that he was carrying and went after the man with this bottle. And that is when the police were called. They weren't called because he told the clerk he had just killed his best mate. They were called the next day when he attacked another man. When cops arrived at the scene on the sidewalk, Gary was still wielding the bottle, and he said to the cops, "Have you ever seen Fright Fest?" That's another film that Gary was obsessed with. The cops said no, and Gary said, "Well, last night it was like Fright Fest." Then Gary went into a rant about Andrew. He called him a pedophile to the police. The police start asking him who Andrew is, and very quickly they find out something has happened. The police go to Andrew's flat and discover his body, and Gary and Christine were arrested. The police then put a timeline together using area CCTV footage and credit card statements. When Christine was questioned, she blamed the entire thing on Gary, saying that she had shown up at her boyfriend, Andrew's house, and Gary had brutally beaten him before torturing and stabbing him to death. Apparently, the court believed Christine to some extent because she was let go. Gary initially pled not guilty, but after being presented with the overwhelming evidence against him, he changed his plea to guilty. Now, this is England, so remember, Gary got 12 years for Andrew's murder, but then got a life sentence for attacking the man with the bottle. So I'm not really sure how that works. Gary is still in prison and does have the possibility for parole in a few years. Andrew's family released a statement saying he was a wonderful man and that he will be truly missed, that he invited Gary into his home, and for that, he lost his life. It is said that Gary has been watching a lot of horror films while locked away in prison, and I just don't know how I feel about that. Our second story today is a very strange one, and one that reminds us just how blurry the lines of fantasy and reality are for some people. This story takes place in West Lothian, Scotland, and involves a serious horror fan by the name of Allan Menzies. First, let's talk a little bit about the film that inspired this murder. That film is Queen of the Damned. Queen of the Damned is a vampire film that takes its screenplay from the Anne Rice novel, The Vampire Chronicles series. At the center of this story, Queen of the Damned, is Akasha, the queen vampire played by Aaliyah. I personally believe Aaliyah would have become a superstar. Aaliyah was, of course, killed very shortly after the filming of this movie when her twin-engine Cessna crashed in the Bahamas on August 25th, 2001. That crash killed everyone aboard. I remember when it happened, and it was so shocking. Aaliyah wasn't yet uber famous. People knew who she was, but she wasn't Beyonce yet. But she was on her way there, in my opinion. There was just that vibe around her. You could just feel it. She was going to be someone very famous. And then it all ended at only 22 years old. People forget she was 22. 9 others died in that plane crash, including the pilot and 7 members of Aaliyah's entourage. Included her record executive, her hairdresser, her bodyguard. It was really tragic. In Queen of the Damned, Akasha is this very seductive, very dangerous, but very beautiful monster. Stuart Townsend plays Lestat, who is awakened by members of a hard rock band, and then he becomes the band's singer. It's an entertaining movie. I wouldn't say it's a great movie. Lestat then decides to use his stardom to out all the other vampires, and that is how Akasha is introduced to the modern world. The movie at the time was very edgy and dark, sultry, sexy, you know, the whole music scene. It hasn't aged very well. But for people who have seen it, if you saw it when it came out, I mean, for me anyways, it kind of holds a special place in my heart. It's a little bit of a timestamp of the vibe back then, you know, for us old people. Now, it's easy to see why people get a little obsessive about vampires and vampire films. Vampires are always young and beautiful, and on top of that, they're powerful and dangerous. I mean, there was no one as obsessed with Angel like I was, and then, of course, Spike, who, let's be honest, is a superior vampire to Angel. I can't even tell you how many times my kids and I sat down and watched Buffy from start to finish. But, you know, Twilight had so many women in a tizzy, a chokehold, and that lasted for damn near a decade. There is something very appealing and very provocative about vampires. And although they are usually men in pop culture, Akasha stands out as being equally alluring and powerful and vicious. By December of 2002, this young man, Allan Menzies, 22 years old, was firmly obsessed with Akasha, with Aaliyah, with Queen of the Damned. And Allan was about a half bubble off plum. Allan was not only obsessed with vampires, but he wanted to be a vampire. He wanted to become a vampire, and he considered Akasha his queen. He wasn't so sure that Akasha was just a film character. To Allan, she was very, very real. Allan told people that he had seen Queen of the Damned well over 100 times. Sometimes he would watch it 3 times a day. As Allan watched the film, he became convinced that Akasha was speaking to him, sending him messages through the movie. That reminds me of the saying, when you talk to God, it's called prayer. If God talks back to you, it's called schizophrenia. Because that is one hell of a true saying. I'm thinking Allan may have been schizophrenic. It sounds like an apt diagnosis, but I was not able to find any information on whether or not he had ever received that diagnosis. Allan was obsessed with his queen, and before long, she wasn't just talking to Allan through the film, she was appearing to him. Now, the character of Akasha, who's obviously a vampire, in life, she had been an ancient Egyptian queen. And as the queen, she was very jealous of this pair of twin witches. So there's an event in Akasha's life as a human that occurs where Akasha is infused with the essence of these 2 powerful witches. And that ties all vampires to Akasha forever. Well, Allan becomes convinced that he too is tied to Akasha forever. He is one of the vampires that is connected with her on a very real level, real to him. Allan began to call himself Leon. He said that was his vampire name. He was really beginning to lose it at that point. I think it's important that we talk about Allan's childhood for a moment. You know, we like to delve into the psychology of these killers here on Dark Hearts. Allan was a kid that was really bullied as a child and in school. His life at school was pretty torturous. There was a group of boys that would tease Allan and beat him up whenever they got the chance. Well, one day Allan had had enough and he decided to bring a knife to school. When one of the bullies approached Allan, Allan pulled out the knife and he stabbed the boy in the stomach. Now, of course, Allan got into a lot of trouble for that, but in his mind, that was a very small price to pay for what he got in return. Allan was no longer the kid at school who got bullied. He was the kid at school who stabbed someone. He went from being laughed at to being feared, and it was intoxicating for Allan. As Allan grew up, he never forgot the lesson that he learned that day. For him, it was better to be feared than to be bullied. It was better to be feared than it was to be liked. When Allan got older, he started hanging out with a young man named Thomas McKenzie. In a very tragic and ironic twist of fate, Thomas McKenzie actually owned the copy of Queen of the Damned that Allan first borrowed and then became obsessed with. Thomas begins to notice that Allan is changing. He notices that Allan's getting more and more withdrawn and more reclusive. Then, when Allan tells Thomas that he has changed his name to Leon, Thomas kind of teases him a bit, and that triggers something inside of Allan. A few days later, on December 11th, 2002, Thomas comes over to Allan's apartment, and of course, Allan is watching Queen of the Damned. Well, Thomas kind of starts poking at Allan and asking him, how can you sit and watch this same movie over and over? And Allan starts to get really angry. Thomas then tells Allan that he thinks the movie is stupid and he doesn't like Akasha, he doesn't like the film, he doesn't like the character, and he thinks this obsession with Akasha is weird. Then Allan turned to Thomas and he said, don't talk about my queen that way. And Thomas bursts out laughing and he's like, your queen? What are you talking about? She's a character in a movie. Allan flies into a rage. Not only is he angry, but he is convinced that in order to become a vampire himself, he has to kill someone. Allan has believed that for quite some time, but he's just been waiting for the right moment to take action, and this was it. Allan grabbed a baseball bat and a hammer, and he begins striking Thomas repeatedly on the head, face, and body. He beats Thomas so badly that Thomas cannot get out of the apartment. Before long, he's down on the ground, and then Allan becomes the monster he has thought about for so long. Allan grabbed a knife and began stabbing his friend Thomas. When Thomas was dead, Allan grabbed a cup from the kitchen and filled it with Thomas's blood, which he drank. I can't go into a lot more detail here, but what I will tell you is that Allan also ate a piece of Thomas's brain. It's about all I can say. There is more to it than that, but this guy, Allan, was gone at this point. You have to be completely gone to murder your best friend, drink his blood, and then eat part of his brain. After all of this kind of came to an end, Allan would later claim that he spoke with Akasha and offered Thomas death to her in exchange for eternal life. Not long after the attack, Allan's father came home. He saw that there were spots of blood around the house, and he asked Allan what happened. Allan told his father that he'd cut himself on a can. His dad believed him. A day later, Thomas's family reported him missing. The police began speaking with everyone who knew Thomas, and that included Allan. When they spoke with Allan, some of the investigators remember getting kind of a bad vibe from him, but they didn't have evidence of any kind to tie Allan to Thomas's disappearance. Then, on January 4th, a resident saw something sticking up out of a rock along the moors. The police were sent to the area, and there they found Thomas's clothing in a bag. Knowing that Allan was the last person to be with Thomas, they asked the judge for a search warrant for Allan's home, and one was granted. It was at that time, while asking for the warrant, that the police learned of Allan's history, learned that he had stabbed a classmate years ago when the two were just in junior high. The police went through the Menzies house, and as soon as they left, Allan took an overdose of drugs and ended up in the hospital. Then a week later, on January 18th, 2003, while the police were still looking for Thomas's body, they found it. Constable Kenneth Gray spotted a forearm and a hand sticking out of a drainage ditch in a wooded area north of Fauldhouse. Thomas's remains were found there in a shallow grave. The body was sent for autopsy, and the coroner found that he had been stabbed 42 times with a large knife. He'd also been bludgeoned over the head 6 times with a heavy object, swung at a high speed, and his skull had multiple fractures. The pathologist indicated in his report that the attack had been carried out over a prolonged period of time. This didn't happen in 3 minutes. Allan continued to batter Thomas's body even after he was dead. The police took Allan into custody, and they were shocked by what he told them. Allan said that he had killed Thomas to sell his soul in order to be born into another form. He also told the police that he knew Thomas had to be killed and that he now has his soul. Allan went on to say that he didn't really feel sorry for killing Thomas. It was just something that had to be done. He seemed to be very detached from what had occurred, and a psychiatrist was brought in to examine him. As the days went on and Allan sat in jail, the gravity of what he had done started to sink in. In an interview that took place before trial, Allan told police, quote, "I could never get the thought of being a vampire out of my head. To put it bluntly, after I had seen the tape so many times, I wanted to go out and murder people." He then said that he truly believed drinking Thomas's blood would make him a vampire and seal his pact with Akasha, but now he wasn't so sure. Allan went on trial. The prosecution introduced the actual videotapes from Allan's collection as evidence. Among them were, of course, Queen of the Damned, along with others, and then there were several books by Anne Rice, including one of the Vampire Chronicles books, as well as Blood and Gold. Allan had written some things on the books, and on one page he wrote, quote, "The blood is the life. I have drunk the blood, and it shall be mine, for I have seen horror." One of the attorneys asked Allan what he thought the outcome of the trial should be, and Allan said, "I'm going to get 20 to 25 for this, for doing him with the hammer and my Bowie knife." And then he repeated again, "But I got his soul." The attorneys asked how Allan got Thomas's body to the wooded area where he was found, and Allan replied, "In my wheelie bin." The weapons that Allan used to kill Thomas were later found buried in the same area, but a little ways from the body. At the end of the trial, Allan got life in prison. Life in Europe means more like 15 to 20 years. Allan was ordered to serve a minimum of 18. Not even 2 years after he was sent to prison, Allan was found dead in his cell. He had taken his own life. We hear all kinds of excuses made by people who kill. It was for love, it was for money, it was out of anger, it was for jealousy, and once in a while we hear killers who make the claims we've talked about today. This is nothing new. Killers have been blaming music and film and video games for the last 50 years. They'll be blaming those things and more for the next 500, but their claims will never be enough to convince me that a film or a song made them kill. That choice was all their own. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Please Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you want to support me, and you can join my Patreon. If you support me on Patreon, your money goes to help keep the videos coming. But we're also doing fundraising, and we've got one in progress now. This is the thumbnail. If you would like all of the information on our fundraiser that's going on right now, go find this video and watch it. We are raising money to donate to police departments who have cold case DNA in storage that's never been tested. There are thousands of sexual assault kits sitting in refrigeration that have never been tested. They cost between $500 and $750 a kit. We're going to raise money, we're going to vote on a case, we're going to donate the money to that cause and get that kit tested. Not only might we solve a crime, we will get that perpetrator's DNA in the system forever in case they are connected with other crimes. So far, this fundraiser's raised about $125, so if you can, go and donate and help us out. I sure appreciate you, and I hope you're doing well. Spring is right around the corner. You got this. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.